The Cannabis Heals Me podcast, episode 96.
You're listening to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast, where we explore the real stories of real people who have discovered the profound healing properties of the cannabis plant in their own lives. Find more at cannabishealsme.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. This is your host, Rachel Kennerly, coming to you once again from the Storybook Inn Studios. So glad you guys are joining us today. We got another great healing story for you. But before I introduce our guest for today, I want to encourage you to go out and subscribe to the podcast so that it will automatically download to your podcast app of your choice. And also, while you're out there subscribing, if you can give us a rating or review, we would sincerely appreciate that. And the reason I ask you to do that is because it boosts the algorithms, and the podcast app will actually recommend this show to other people who are listening to similar type programs. I also want to encourage you to take part in our Tell 3 People Challenge. Each week, we ask you to share the podcast with 3 people that you know, or maybe somebody you don't know. Maybe you're standing in the grocery line and you're tired of looking at the National Enquirer, so you just tell the folks standing next to you, hey, I know this cool podcast about cannabis is medicine, cannabishealsme.com. You ought to go check it out. But if you're an introvert like me, you probably won't do that. So my best advice to you is to tell people that you actually know and tell them about the stories that we're telling, and maybe tell them about some of the cannabis adjacent issues that we cover, like CPS. And I think our episode on CPS should be shared with every parent so that they understand what their parental rights are when CPS comes knocking on the door. And that's not limited just to people who are using cannabis as medicine or for other reasons. I think it should be required listening for every single parent out there, because they need to know what their rights are and how they can preserve those rights and protect their family as a result. So if you haven't listened to episode 95, I encourage you to go back and do that. It is an excellent episode with some great advice from Krista McIntyre with the Family Rights Advocacy Group. My guest today is Moriah Barnhart. Moriah is coming on to share the story of her daughter, Dahlia, who was diagnosed with brain cancer at the age of 2 years old. And she's going to share how cannabis made a huge impact on Dahlia's life and helped with her recovery from chemo. Moriah, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I came across your name when I saw an article by Josh, and I'm terribly sorry I can't remember his last name.
Crosney.
Yes, Josh Crosney. Because again, I have a 2-second memory. I remembered his first name, though.
Yeah, there you go.
So he had done a piece on both you and Gail Rand, and I wanted to have you on to talk about your daughter, Dahlia, and y'all's journey with cannabis.
Okay, yeah. Josh throws the Cannabis Science Conference, and so I've known him just before that, and Gail and I are regular panel participants. He's consistently kind of shining a light on the need for advocacy and awareness in the pediatric realm, which I'm super appreciative of. In the same vein, obviously, doing shows like this is important because, the more people that are aware that pediatrics comes with its own difficulties, but is just as important as any other demographic of people fighting for the right to have options in treatment. This is a demographic that the risks are kind of doubled. So if you're a patient and you're using medicine legally or illegally, honestly, because even legally, we know that there are risks involved. Law enforcement uses a lot of discretion. And even when you're following the law, it's not necessarily protection entirely, that you're not going to be in trouble for utilizing cannabis. But with children comes, if you're in an illegal state, obviously that comes with its own sets of risks. But even in a legal state, you've got the risk of DCF coming into your home and ruining your lives if you as a parent are using this plant. But if you're giving it to your child, those risks are so much greater. You have hospital staff, watching you like a hawk. Special needs children by far are at greatest risk of DCF involvement, or Child and Protective Services involvement. Just being special needs. They end up with bruises, they end up with injuries. So the statistics really are very clear on the fact that if you are a parent of a special needs child, your risk of Child Protection Services is much higher for them to be involved in your life anyway, which you're already living a very stressful life comparatively. And that's a huge amount of stress to have that kind of involvement in your personal life, your home life, your family life. But when you're adding on to that, that now law enforcement may get involved, it's a very scary venture. And my hope is that in sharing these stories, in raising awareness and education, that other parents find their best way to guide themselves through their own journey in a way that isn't as, you're already, a lot of these parents, myself included, end up with severe PTSD. You're watching your child die and be resuscitated, whether that's in my situation. My daughter was diagnosed with brain cancer at the age of 2 in 2013. And about 6 months into treatment, we started her on cannabis and saw immediate benefits. So you can't unsee what you see with your own eyes, but some parents, their children are seizing, they're turning blue, they're having to be resuscitated in that sense. And watching a child seize is extremely traumatic anyway. So some of these parents are watching their children seize hundreds of times a day. It's just a very traumatic situation to be in. And the amount of fear that's involved when you then think that you're going to have a SWAT team raiding your home in the middle of the night adds such an unreal amount of fear. You're already dealing with watching your child breathe at night, watching them sleep at night, not being able to sleep yourself. Often these parents are completely falling apart, nutrient deprived. They've lived off coffee for years. And when I say these parents, I'm talking about myself here, but I have met so many parents along the way who are just like me in that regard. I think that part of the raising awareness is to let these parents know that we're all in the same boat and we do have to take care of each other and we have to take care of ourselves because these children are dependent on us and we know that, but pouring from an empty cup is what we've all been taught to do, especially as women, historically in the Western world and, globally really, but I can speak for my American raising. Women sacrifice, self-sacrifice. We're entirely selfless. We're taught that that's what love means. We grow up, we get married, we have kids, we raise them, we care for our spouses. Then we're caregivers for our elderly parents. And pouring from an empty cup is just kind of our societal nature. And I think that it's really important that we acknowledge that that's not okay. We can't survive like that. You hear all of these horrible stories about parents committing homicides, suicides. They know no one else can ever care for their child, but they know they can't continue to do it. Their child's suffering. They have no options. And I think that that's where the awareness of cannabis as a healing modality really comes into play, is that there are just some things on this earth that are great for a plethora of problems. And this is one of those plants.
I didn't realize that special needs children were more likely to have involvement with Child Protective Services. So that's very interesting. Has that been an issue for y'all, or is that just stuff that you've heard from other people?
That is something that I fortunately threw myself into education. I was in a hospital bed, I had a laptop, and I immersed myself in education, whether it was talking to scientists and researchers about cannabis or just searching through other parents' journeys and information. And in that, I uncovered studies. There's actually been tons of studies done on special needs households, how special needs children are cared for, government involvement, whether that's through assistance or through, harmful issues like Child Protective Services being involved when it's unnecessary. And the thing is I understand, I'm just a normal person like everyone else. I understand that when a child looks injured, it has to be investigated. But I just think that if there was a more intimate and open relationship, and this is the same argument we make with cannabis, but really it goes across the board. If there was an intimate and honest and transparent relationship between medical professionals and the people that are depending on them to help them, then these issues wouldn't be nearly so common. So a lot of the time with special needs children, they end up in emergency rooms and at hospitals where medical professionals don't know the families very well. And that's when Child Protective Services will end up involved. So I think it's really important that protocols be laid out for these families. I wish that these, social workers can only do so much, but I wish that there was more education on how to involve our everyday medical professionals more deeply into the rest of our children's care, because could an emergency room medical professional contact somebody who's known our children? My children's pediatrician has been their pediatrician, both of them, their entire lives. So my daughter's 9, my son is almost 16, and they both have the same pediatrician, have known us for 16 years. And I feel confident that should there ever be a question as to my parenting, how I treat my children, how my children are cared for, their overall health, whether or not there's ever been concerns, maintaining really strong relationships. I think that one of the things we see in alternative and supplemental care is kind of a disdain for conventional medicine. And I think that while none of us are truly extremists at heart, we become extremists. And we see this in society, from politics to what we're talking about here today. And I think that the truth is there's kind of in between. If you have a heart attack, you're going to be very thankful for conventional medicine, right? Now, whether or not you can prevent that heart attack, there's a lot of alternative and supplemental options along the way that could probably prevent that. So it's just kind of a balance. And I think that we need to stop. We've given a really bad name, say, for instance, to our teachers, right? We've been blameful of teachers. Our education system is very poor in this country. It's particularly poor where I live in Florida. We put a lot of weight on the shoulders of teachers, and it's really unfair. And so what you're seeing is less quality human beings going into the profession that doesn't pay very well and isn't treated very well. And that's what we're going to start seeing in the medical profession if we don't start having a little more open-mindedness and dialogue. So for instance, early on in my journey, my daughter's original pediatric neuro-oncologist, renowned for her willingness and want to work with these children with diagnoses such as brain cancer, did not want to discuss cannabis at all. And I could have easily turned that into a story of, this horrible tyrant. But I pushed and backed off when I felt it was too much for her. And then I made the decision on my own without the support of a medical team, which was very, very scary. I was in an illegal state. We had traveled to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, the only treating St. Jude hospital at that time in Memphis, Tennessee. So we were in an illegal state, and now I didn't have the support of my daughter's medical team. But she ended up in such bad shape that nobody was really going to stop me from trying anything that might help her. We saw immediate benefits from cannabis. And a few months later, I got an email from her doctor that said she had left the world's leading children's research hospital to go head up cannabis research in another state, because you can't unsee what you see with your own eyes. So rather than looking at these doctors with disdain, I think it needs to be repeated time and time again that there are plenty of people who have been at the forefront of this fight who were not a part of it before something tragic happened in their life. And sad to say, that was me. I had no idea that this fight was even taking place. Of course, we all grew up, saw that this, of all of the options of things you could do recreationally, even as teenagers, young adults, this was a safe option. But nobody really was going to take it further than that. It wasn't something we were going to go, spend our entire lives and livelihoods and pick up everything to go travel to our state capitals and to the, Washington, D.C. But then comes this huge tragic incident, opens your eyes, you start researching and educating yourself, and you change your position. So we need to look at opposition with a little more humanity, I feel like. They just need to see with their own eyes, too.
Hey guys, wanted to tell you real quick about our podcast host and sponsor, Anchor.fm. If you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I highly recommend Anchor. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go out to Anchor.fm to get started. That's Anchor.fm. Now back to the show. Well, I agree with that. And that's kind of the approach we take, is we don't try to demonize people, except for maybe politicians.
Well, there are some politicians who for sure have been educated and are intentionally ignorant. There's a big
Right.
difference between vested interest and intentional ignorance
Yes.
versus everyday people who are really trying to do their best in the world and just aren't educated.
Right. And that's kind of the approach we take is we try to educate people. That's why we like to tell these stories because we feel like storytelling is a way to break through the hard exterior of people who don't
I
think
think it's the
cannabis is
only way.
medicine. Yeah. Cuz the pushback that we it's just for stoners. It's like, no, look at these but to cite, statistics and numbers, people don't care about that, but people do care about other people.
I will tell you, when I saw the impact, I had not only my daughter's neuro-oncologist leaving St. Jude to go head up cannabis research, St. Jude itself, while maybe not publicly, has embarked on the journey of research of cannabis in the same realm. Um, I started to get, emails and letters from other people, from voters and from politicians. And when I saw what telling my daughter's story was doing for the hearts and minds of our voters and our quote unquote leaders, that was the point of starting Canna Moms. This was back in the end of 2013, and it was kind of a formal initiation in 2014. Was that if my daughter's story could make this impact, I just needed to find other parents who had similar stories, whether they needed my help or they were already on their own journey, that we could get to tell their story too. Because I didn't want to come back to the state of Florida advocating for legalization here and have people believe that they would be voting for one little girl. I wanted them to know and understand that we were working with pastors' wives. We're working with just our everyday integrated members of society. We helped form the YMCA's first pediatric cancer survivorship program. I've sat on the St. Jude Family Centered E-Council for years. I'm very involved in my community, and it was clear to me from the start that voters and politicians alike needed to know and understand this was a topic that touched many, many lives, not just ours, not just a few, not just a handful, but many, many lives across the state, across the nation, and across the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think more people, well, you've got the fear factor with giving something to your child that is still illegal. And then people don't want to say anything because they don't want a SWAT team raiding their house and taking their child away. So there have been a lot of people who are just, they aren't bold and they don't tell the story because they're afraid that someone's going to come and take their child. So it's more prevalent than people realized.
Well, and what I also did was I got a lot of these. I actually just have a social media thing that came up today. I was tagged in one of the moms who's very conservative, goes to church 3 times a week, and in kind of initiating, giving her a platform and a spotlight and making her comfortable to utilize it and be in that spotlight. For me, most of the families we've worked with are not going to be on the news. They're not going to be testifying in front of Senate. They're not going to be going to Washington, D.C. But what they do is they tell their neighbor, they tell their sister, they tell their family members and their friends. They get more comfortable with their story. And as they move forward, even if they're only sharing it with people within their own community, that is still changing votes.
Yeah, you're right. Because a story is what changed my mind. A story of a little boy who was having seizures, like hundreds of seizures a day, and they packed up and moved to Colorado because I'm in Texas, and they had to pack up and move to Colorado because Texas Children's Hospital told her if she even tried CBD oil with her son, they would call CPS on her.
Yep.
They're very powerful. The testimonies are very, very powerful, and once you've seen it in action and you've seen someone's life changed for the better, you can't go back and say, oh no, it's just for getting high.
That's right. And you know what? Even if all it did. So I have a lot of faith in the idea that science is bringing us to a place where we will be able to utilize cannabinoids for things like inducing death of cancer cells. I also believe that it's regenerative. It restores brain damage and nerve damage. And these are all pie in the sky ideas, but we do have enough science to show that we're getting there. Now, if it didn't do any of those things, and this is what I try to explain to people, there is no antiemetic in the world that works for chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. These kids are so atrophied, they are so sickly, they're so nutrient deprived. Most of the children I've seen on treatment are dying from organ damage and heart failure, things like that. They're on nutrition through IVs, which is can be very hard on your organs. They are obviously on chemotherapies, which we know are very, very hard on the organs. So if all it did was help these kids eat, if all it did was take away their nausea and vomiting, that would be enough. Now, you add on to that the fact that we know it does make you feel good. So when you talk about getting high, it's such a scary thing to talk about. These kids are being given morphine like candy, morphine from the opium plant, and no one blinks an eye. And the only medical benefit of that plant is to get you high. That's what the pain relief is from. So now when you add on to the fact that it helps with the nausea and vomiting, it helps them keep food down, maybe avoid getting a surgery for a feeding tube like my daughter did, which can come with complications of infection and death. So in that regard, then you add on that it does get you high. It is pain relieving, and it can be given in doses that don't induce the kind of high that people are thinking about, but it can just induce that pain relief. Now, that would just be enough if that alone was all it did. So you're talking about these little benefits that we quote unquote, consider little, but they're huge in the survival rate, in the life, and in the quality of life of these children, patients of all ages and all ailments. If somebody is in pain, it will ruin their life. So when you have a politician sitting on stage talking about, and then everybody's going to use it for back pain, absolutely they should. Back pain will ruin your life. Chronic pain will ruin your life. It will ruin your personality, your ability to love other people, your ability to interact and socialize. If all it did was relieve pain by getting someone high like morphine does, without the side effects of possible death, organ damage, the things that come with drugs like morphine, as a respiratory depressant, which cannabis is not, if that was all it did was replace a drug like morphine, that would be enough. But it just does so much more. It's so universal in its ability to help suffering people. I just think that anybody who's seen these stories, and now every politician has, because we've had people in every state going to their state capitals telling these stories for 7 years now, and some longer, obviously. These politicians now do know. And so I think that there's no justification for ignorance at that point. So where I do say that we need to treat opposition with humanity, we also need to hold people accountable. And when people are intentionally harming others because of their own personal vested interests and biases, that's where we draw a line.
No, I agree with you on that. And the problem with politicians is there are usually other motivational factors as to why they don't want to legalize. Maybe they get a big campaign contributions from big pharma.
Yeah, and generally with politicians, I've worked with politicians for many years, and I have some very good friends in politics, and they're just everyday people like everyone else. But like law enforcement and like, attorneys, there's a certain draw for a certain type of person to certain jobs, right? So you do have a certain type of person generally attracted to the job of a politician.
Yes.
But the general goal of a politician is to climb the ranks. Sometimes you'll see these politicians who we love best are the ones who are older judges who are going to retire, older politicians who've been there, done that, and have nowhere left to go up the ranks. And these politicians are generally the easiest and best to work with because they have nothing to prove to anyone. The politicians who still have somewhere to climb have people to answer to. I try to explain this to people all the time. The Democrat-Republican thing in reality, when you've worked very closely and intimately with politicians, you've been friends with them, you've interacted with them regularly, they go behind closed doors and decide who's going to agree and disagree on what and fight about what. And, so we just have to remember when people have somewhere to climb, you've got to watch who's helping them get there. And that's where their vested interests are going to lie. It's not always money per se. Money's always involved, of course. But a lot of the times it's who they're trying to impress and who they're closely associating with.
Yeah, that's a good point. Going back to your daughter's story, when was it that you guys were in Tennessee, and when was it that, what was her prognosis at the time that you said, screw it, we're going to try cannabis with her?
Well, so my daughter was here in Tampa, Florida, and taken to 3 different hospitals in just a couple days' time. Initially took her in with like flu-like symptoms, but she was starting to have something that kind of looked like seizures. So they immediately did a CAT scan, saw a mass in her brain, transported us by ambulance to another hospital, had some neurosurgeons come in and say, basically that they did not believe she would survive surgery,
Mm.
but that they had to do it because she would undoubtedly die if she didn't have it.
Oh, wow.
So the first question I ever got to ask, and this is such a traumatizing experience, you're laying, with this sickly little baby who's maybe now got a fever and vomiting and is shaking and you can't figure out what's wrong. And then you're told they have brain cancer. I mean, who in a million years would suspect? I've raised children. I have 2 of my own. Never in a million years would that have been something that I would have even suspected. And of course, now it's the only thing I suspect. So you go from one extreme to the other. But so the very first question I ever got to ask in her care was, okay, this surgery is very likely to kill her. What would happen if I didn't sign the release? And this woman, it was a woman neurosurgeon who to this day I owe my daughter's life to in that regard. She said the hospital security would come and remove you from the hospital, and we would do the surgery without your permission. And
Oh my
without custody of your daughter. And there was no emotion involved for her because this was very factual. She wasn't doing it. This is just the way this works. And so I got a very early lesson in the rights and care of our own children here in America and how we feel that we have so many rights until something comes up that requires us to utilize those rights. And suddenly it comes crashing down on us that we are, in fact, not free. So from that point forward, that was kind of repeatedly my question was, what if I didn't agree to this? What are my options? Your options are chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, depending on what medical professionals and experts say your child needs. And if you don't agree to that, the state will take custody and they will undergo treatment without you.
Yeah,
so
and if
it's
you
not
leave
really an
state,
option.
yeah, and if you leave the state to seek out alternative treatments, they will track you down and drag your kid back.
Well, that's the thing. There are no alternative treatments. They consider chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation the only options for these children. And by and large, I mean, it has saved lots of lives, right? So like I said, I'm not, a big conventional medicine basher like a lot of subculture people are, but in the same respect, it's saving their lives at what cost? These children are left completely brain damaged. These children are left with chronic lifelong injuries. They are unable to even say the ones that make it out the absolute best, the ones who make it out without severe organ damage, severe brain damage, the ones who make it out the absolute best are still going to have so many lifelong issues, whether it's psychiatric, psychological, that they can't get life insurance, that marriage is difficult, they're now infertile, they can't have children. I mean, there's just all of these things that people don't take into consideration. We owe these children better. Yes, what we have going on right now is in an attempt to save lives, but we have to start looking at quality of life. We have to. These kids deserve it.
Yeah, and the medical professionals, they're just kind of looking with a very narrow lens at the right now. They're not looking long-term necessarily. It's like we have to save this child's life right now.
And we do a 5-year survival rate as to whether or not treatment's been successful. But what about 6 years out? What about 15 years out? So I think it's just really important to note what you're saying right now, which is that this doctor wants to save this child right now. And I'm so appreciative of that. My daughter's life depended on that many times. But when you start looking at the long-term side effects, when you start looking at the long-term deficits and neurological and cognitive issues, brain damage, organ damage, just the lifelong issues, you have to take a step back and say, we are doing some really good things in medicine across the globe and in this country, but we are not doing enough for these children. Adults can make the decision for themselves. Now, there comes a fuzzy line when what is somebody's IQ? Can they really research on their own? Do they really have the ability to get the education on their own? Because then it also becomes taking advantage of someone and unfair even to adult patients. But, adults can make decisions for themselves. They can decide to get treatment or not get treatment, to get radiation or chemotherapy, to completely, I watched my godmother die of a very treatable breast cancer when I was 20 years old because we were raised not believing in conventional medicine. And that was just the route she chose to take. And to this day, I live with that decision because she was a grown adult and she made her own decision. When we're talking about children, we not only do we not have options for them, but we have a much deeper drive to help them than we do to help ourselves, generally, I believe. And so, yeah, so these children can't make that decision for themselves. And now we find out neither can the parents. So really only medical professionals, people who are trained in conventional medicine. And I think people think of medicine as something very solid. You know, we didn't know about women's reproductive organs until the last decade. It's still not in medical textbooks. Doctors did not learn about the endocannabinoid system in school, an entire receptor system of the body that our body creates, drugs within our own body that go and touch receptors and do things to our body. Doctors don't know about it. They're learning about it on their own now. Fortunately, a lot of them have taken the step to kind of become educated on something they realized was left entirely out of their medical education. But we've got to do better, and we've got to give people rights to make decisions, because once we educate people, what good does that education do if their hands are tied and they're not able to make any decisions?
Yeah, if the decisions are still in the hands of medical professionals and politicians and bureaucrats, then...
And I'm willing to do the research, thousands of hours of research, talking to researchers across the globe. The first person I ever talked to about cannabis was Raphael Mechoulam in Israel.
Oh, wow.
These are some of the world's leaders on these subjects. I'm willing to do that work. But you know what? A very, very busy pediatric neuro-oncologist who's trying every single day to do the best they can with the knowledge they have, working, 12, 16, sometimes 20-hour days in a very stressful job for very many years, they're probably not going to take the initiative to go learn about something like cannabis 7 years ago. Fortunately, the information's out enough that it's no longer looked at as this ridiculous thing that they would just be wasting time looking up, right? But this many years ago, we have to remember, that's my daughter. She's the only one for me. She's one of 20 kids for a doctor, or 100 kids, depending on what kind of doctor it is. And so there's a level of personal accountability, responsibility, a necessity of education, awareness, of our own awareness, but also then helping other people be aware. But if at the end of all of that, if our hands are tied, what good does any of it do? And that's why we continue to push for legislation and federal descheduling, is because, okay, so we got Florida legal. And now children, there's a way for children to get the recommendations in the state of Florida. But what about Alabama? What about a kid who is in the exact same situation my daughter was, and her mom's completely ignorant to this? I mean, I was at first too, but I'm very fortunate that enough information was brought to me and I had enough background and ability to reach out to people like Mechoulam. And not everyone has that. Not everyone's capable of that. Not everyone has contacts and connections. And so I feel like, our job in life is to use whatever privilege we're born with to help other people who maybe don't have those same privileges. And so same goes for, our abilities. If I'm able to do something that someone else isn't able to do, then maybe just help them, right? Somebody who doesn't have a voice, be their voice. Somebody who doesn't have a stage or a platform or a spotlight, give them that. And I just think it's really important that we ensure that people know and understand, as state legalization comes, that federal descheduling is still such a necessity. State legalization is great because I believe personally, if something's going to be sold on a shelf, it should be regulated. However, I also believe that if somebody wants to grow a safe plant in their backyard, they should be able to. And you can have those two things simultaneously, but not until the federal laws are addressed.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of more conservative states, I don't think they're, like in Texas, I don't think they'll ever allow home grow, or at least maybe not in the next decade or so.
Yeah. And then you have people, this is the first time I think in our country that we have seen people choosing to relocate for laws.
Yeah.
I don't think that in the time I've been alive, I don't even think in the time my parents have been alive. So we think of this as like a new industry and the first new industry we're going to see in our lifetimes. But in reality, we have to look at all these other firsts. This is the first time in our country's history that anybody can recall that people are relocating across the country because of a law.
Mm-hmm.
Zip codes are determining what medicine you can take and what you can do with your body, and that's not okay.
No, I agree completely with that. Going back to your daughter's story, I guess they did the surgery?
They did several surgeries. So the first surgery that they did left her with partial right side paralysis. She was unable to eat, walk, or talk. We're very fortunate that we've had a lot of therapists in our lives over the years. She's had some pretty intense speech, physical and occupational therapy. So we ended up heading up after that surgery. She actually had that surgery, and then she had a port placed after a partial resection. So these are 3 surgeries that she had in that first week. We ended up sending biopsy slides out and had mixed reviews of what people believed this primary tumor in her brain was. So we ended up going to St. Jude, and they had diagnosed her with what was called anaplastic pilocytic astrocytoma. And they were going to do a high-grade treatment for the fast-growing cells first, which chemotherapy best addresses the faster-growing cancers. So pros and cons to both. In primary brain tumors, they're graded, not staged. So high-grade and low-grade is kind of the spectrum of how fast the cells are growing inside that brain. So she already had a fairly large tumor that was branched out like a spider, couldn't be resected. Took her to St. Jude, and right before she could start treatment, she stopped breathing, and resuscitations were really difficult. Something was going on where they couldn't get it, the tubing down. So she was rushed to another hospital and had another emergency surgery where they placed a shunt to drain fluid buildup and pressure from her brain down to her stomach. Wow. And was started on treatment while she was intubated. I mean, this is a really long story, but to shorten it up, it's just imagine a 2-year-old who can't talk and cannot possibly understand what's going on, waking up intubated with their arms boarded. You're letting people torture them. What did they do? There's no way to understand. So she was started on treatment while she was intubated with her arms boarded. Wow. And the side effects were pretty immediate. She had mouth sores and canker sores down her entire gastrointestinal tract.
Oh,
actually,
my gosh.
She had diaper rashes, quote unquote, that were really just like bloody skin, missing, raw. She had obviously nerve damage. That's an ongoing issue, but she had severe nerve damage, spinum and Christine and blasting, both of which come from plants and nature and are very toxic and cause severe nerve damage. She's brain damage, nerve damage, sores. Her mouth is bleeding. She's still intubated. She's in pain. She doesn't know what's going on. Nobody can explain to her because she can't comprehend why you're doing this to her. And we went through several months of that. And of course, it's on and off. It's not constantly all horrific, but really when you look back, it's like just months of horror and terror because you're trying to make things okay for her. You're bringing in gifts and toys and volunteers. But in reality, it's just this nightmare. A few months into treatment, she had an emergency. I was trying to convince her doctor something was going on with her, and we finally got a neuro check to show something was going on. We didn't know what it was. Again, she was rushed to the hospital up the street, Le Bonheur, for another emergency surgery. But this time, because of her history of stopping breathing and having to be resuscitated, the emergency nature of the surgery meant there was no preparation involved. Because they weren't prepared, when she ended up coming out of that surgery to have a second shunt placed from her skull to her stomach, there's 2 different kinds. Or there's actually several different kinds of shunts, but she needed a second kind of shunt. So the first was left in and a second was placed. She came out of that surgery with no pain medicine. And I think that everybody at that time was so traumatized. I mean, there was nurses in the hallway crying. Everybody felt so helpless. And because she had been stopping breathing and had such difficulty being resuscitated, they couldn't give her respiratory depressants like morphine, which is what you would normally get out of a surgery like that. And at that time, nobody was going to oppose me trying cannabis. I had already received cannabis from amazing people. Had I think 3 different people from around the country had sent me products, and
wow.
And so, being in an illegal state and without the support of her medical team, starting her on that, she was already doing pretty poorly. She was going to have to get a feeding tube. Likely, her legs were atrophied. She was very, nutrition deprived. Obviously, she was in a lot of pain, clearly after this surgery, even more so than before. And first night, she slept through the night for the first time in her entire life. Even before she was diagnosed, she never slept through the night. They wanted to diagnose her with ADHD. So she woke up hungry and thirsty. She ended up wanting to play with toys. She was kind of extroverted again. And to watch this little girl go from being a 2 to now 3-year-old little kid who lost the will to live, which I can't even put into words what watching a toddler lose their will to live. We think of adults and we think of all we've been through in hardships and being depressed and wanting to lay in bed. When you see a 3-year-old, a toddler, lose their spark, their will to live, that's such an unspeakable experience to watch the light in a toddler's eyes go out. And she got that back immediately. So she no longer had to get a feeding tube, which when you think about all of the things along her journey that could have happened, she could have gotten an infection getting a feeding tube installed while she was on chemotherapy and immunosuppressed. She could have gotten organ damage. She could have ended up on way more medicines for the pain and for the nausea and ended up with liver damage, heart failure. So all of these things, do I know that cannabis went into her body and helped kill cancer cells? I think that we have enough evidence to say that that might be the case, and it does enhance cytotoxic uptake. So when given in conjunction with something toxic like chemotherapy or radiation, it definitely helps kill those cancer cells. But even if you take all that aside and say that that's just speculation for now, without human trials, et cetera, what it did do for her, I believe, saved her life anyway. Just the pain, the alleviating the nausea and vomiting, not having to get the feeding tube, gaining weight, atrophy in her legs going away, being able to walk, being functional, enjoying life. If that's all it did for her was just give her back a joy to be alive, that would have done it for me. And I think that would have done it for her doctor and many other medical professionals that were on her team taking care of her at that time. But it did impress a lot of us to a degree that it was worth it for me to spend the last 7 years doing nothing but caring for her and other kids like her by advocating and by activism about cannabis. I mean, it's not something, why would somebody throw away everything else in their life to focus on something unless they really saw that there was such a great outpoint? That's what I wish people would understand when they see these people on the news and advocating. Why would we do that? Why would we put ourselves in that position and take on that plight and that responsibility when the weight of the world is already on our shoulders? I'm fighting for my daughter's life. I should not also have to be fighting bad laws. But when you see something so beneficial, and then you have to go back and realize just because I figured it out doesn't mean someone else can. We need these laws changed. We need education increased. We need medical professionals learning about the receptor systems in the body. We need federal descheduling. There are so many things that in my lifetime I need to see happen that I'm willing to do what I have to do without sleep and while caring for my daughter and doing all of the other things that a special needs parent does in their everyday life anyway. I'm willing to do this because I got to see firsthand that it really is that beneficial and it really is worth it. And if any other child can avoid the kind of suffering my daughter went through because their parent doesn't know, if they can avoid that just from hearing one story, just from seeing and believing one other parent, then it makes it worth it.
Now, were the doctors aware that you were going to try this with her, or did you?
I had been asking, so I wanted to have the discussion. I wanted to sit down and look at this from an unbiased standpoint. I wanted their input. I was very much a leader of my daughter's team. I felt that this was my team, that we needed to make these decisions together. There just came a point when I had enough evidence to convince me, and they weren't looking at the evidence to convince them, that I had to say, okay, this is a step I'm going to have to take on my own. This is a risk I'm going to have to take. And it turned out that all they needed was to see in front of their own eyes what they saw to be pretty well convinced that there's something here. There's something to it. There's something worth leaving my job to go head up research on this. That's how, kind of unbelievable that miraculous short turnaround. It's just such a quick turnaround for her.
Yeah, that's pretty telling that the doctor left St. Jude's to go and do additional research on that. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I actually just emailed her not that long ago. There's a documentary coming out and I didn't know if they were done filming. And I would really have loved for her to be in it because I'd love to hear. I still have never heard her the way I go out and tell Dahlia's story. I've never heard from her vantage point. She emailed me and said, thanks for, I don't know. It just said something like watching Dahlia helped me make this decision. Which was for me just incredible. If I had just changed the mind of one person who's going to go out and help thousands of children, that alone would have been worth any amount of advocacy and risk taking. Because it wasn't about my daughter. It was about all the children who are suffering. There's so many more children just like her, maybe with other diagnoses. But I've never heard from her vantage point, what went on when she saw Dahlia's recovery, when she saw that turnaround, when she saw the benefits, when she maybe started looking into that research that had been sent to her. I don't know from her standpoint. I know she's a great person who really wants to help children. But I don't know all of the details of what went on in her mind. And to me, that's really intriguing, because the more stories we hear like that, the more we know how to appropriately affect change. We have all these different approaches to activism, but we really need to start with the modern day of social, media and technology and all this information available at our fingertips. I think it's safe to say that we could come up with some really realistic approaches if we could find out from every politician who ever changed their mind. What happened? What made them change their mind? What was really the turning point for them? Every medical professional, every doctor who was once against it, what was the turning point for you? And we could start really replicating successes and not duplicating failures by knowing what worked and what didn't work. That's kind of where we are at, in my opinion, in the time of humanity and activism and moving forward in 2020. That's what we need to start sorting through, is what works and what doesn't work.
Then we can tailor our message. If we can figure out what worked for this person, well, let's try that same approach with this person and see if that works.
I just figured, coming out with my daughter's story and then kind of looking around and seeing all these other parents who maybe needed some encouragement to tell their stories, was across the board throughout history, children touch hearts. And so I remember at times people doing stories on my daughter and saying stuff like, I feel like I'm using her. And I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Go do it. Use her. If you're going to use her to better the world and help other children who are suffering, then do it.
Right.
So we need to really also stop looking at it as using, quote unquote, these children. Yeah, absolutely. If you're telling an untrue story, if you're exaggerating your story, if you're being somebody who maybe isn't good for affecting change and making it risky for the rest of us, or, yeah, I get that there's situations where, I don't know. I think you know what I'm saying.
No, I agree. If using them means that you can help other people, then go ahead, do it. I mean, it's not really, you're not using them. You're
using their story. And
right.
So the thing is if you're exaggerating your child's story, and I've seen the best and the worst of all of humankind in the last 7 years since my daughter's diagnosis, both in the world of special needs children, in the world of cannabis, and all of the different realms and subcultures that I've been introduced to or been a part of. But there are definitely some people who use their children, just like there are good people and bad people in the world. There are good people and bad people who have children. There are good people and bad people who have special needs children. So yeah, no, not everyone's good. And there are people who definitely aren't doing the right thing for the right reasons. But if your storytelling is how we change the world throughout, it's something that it's my favorite thing about being a human being, honestly, is storytelling. Reading growing up was my absolute favorite thing. You can be anywhere at any time with anyone, through words and through stories. And so it's storytelling that's really, I think, affecting societal changes anymore, regardless of what it is, but especially politically. And cannabis, unfortunately, is considered a political issue at this point. I think we've done a really good job in making it a bipartisan issue. Early on, the Democratic Party picked it up as a partisan issue. And so we worked really, really hard to undo that. And to make sure that it was seen in both parties as an issue of compassion and not party. But, it's still a battle. It's a battle that's going to be going on for a long time. And we need as many voices, as many stories as possible, because there's a point in history where there's only one right side of change. And we're at that point. So we just need to tip the scale by telling the stories.
Well, I think we've tipped the scale as far as the general population. It's just getting the politicians to realize that this is a winning issue. You don't have to be afraid that this is some sort of scary thing and people are going to think you're not tough on crime or whatever it is they want to be proud of. This is a winning issue, and they need to realize it. Well, and that's
why I say we need to tell the stories, is because for me, tipping the scale, it doesn't have anything to do anymore with mainstream. We've been, our churches, our pastors' wives come and pray over the plants. And, it's a very, very, it's become like people are compassionate by nature generally. And they've heard these stories because, like I said, even if somebody isn't going to be on the news or on a stage, they're telling their neighbor and their sister. And so I'm more concerned when I say tipping the scales with ensuring that the people, quote unquote leaders, but people in power, people we have, given our trust to do what our will is, those are the people now that need to hear these stories. Because once they know that this is everyone, that this is all of society, then at that point, they're either directly opposing the will of the people, or they're doing their job and implementing it. And people will be able to see for themselves. I tell everyone, cannabis is not an issue of cannabis. Cannabis will tell you who your politicians are. Because if your politicians are voting against something that the will of the people want, that should tell you everything you need to know about them, regardless of cannabis. Like, just use it as a tool. Yeah, exactly.
Well, Moriah, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing Dahlia's story. How is she doing today? I mean,
she's great. She's actually on a genetic inhibitor. So in the last 7 years, science has come so far that they have a specific genetic inhibitor for a mutation that's seen in some of these types of tumors, which I don't know if you know who Tracy Ryan with Cannakids is.
Yes.
Okay.
She was on the documentary, the Ricky Lake documentary.
Oh, she was. Yes, that's right. We did the Nashville premiere at the Nashville Film Fest. But yeah, so she's a good friend of mine for many years, since the beginning of this journey, probably earliest cannabis friends, honestly. But she was starting Cannakids at the same time I was starting Canna Moms. So we were on separate coasts, starting two separate organizations with very similar purposes. And ironically, just very similar names at the same time 7 years ago. And so her daughter, actually, Dahlia's second diagnosis. So she was initially treated for the anaplastic, the high grade part of her diagnosis, what would have been considered at that time most aggressive and deadly. And then later, new growth was considered slow growing. It acted very much like an optic pathway glioma. So ironically, with very, very different diagnosis from the beginning, both of our children were diagnosed with brain cancer, but hers was a low-grade, slow-growing type, and my daughter's was a mixed, high-grade, fast-growing, mixed with low-grade, slow-growing. So very different treatments, very different initial journeys, but friends early on, starting Cannakids on one coast, the Canna Moms on the other, and staying, friends over all these years. Our kids ended up on the same genetic inhibitor for the same genetic mutation, for these very, very different journeys they had been on. So that was a really cool experience for me. Now, I think she might be off it at this point, whereas Dahlia is still on it. But it's just not the same as these harsh chemotherapies that come in and rip your organs up and, injure all your fast-growing cells. And genetic inhibition is a really quality, in my opinion, field that we need to be looking more into. And I think there are a lot of medical professionals who agree. And fortunately, those are, the same people whose eyes have been open to things like cannabis and the fact that we just need to do better for these kids all the way around.
That's pretty cool that they had such different diagnoses and that yet they still wound up on the same type of
I just kept wondering what the universe was trying to tell me, because it was such a weird, it was a very, very weird experience. Yeah.
Well, that's always nice to have somebody that that y'all can kind of share experiences and say, well, this is what's going on here, and kind of compare notes as to what's happening with each of your daughters.
That's the whole point of Canna Moms. This you have to have community. Like I said, it's morbid. No one wants to talk about it, but there's a lot of really bad things that go on in the world of special needs parenting. People aren't taking care of themselves. They are going crazy. No one likes to use the word. I know there's a taboo and stigma attached to it, but when we break a leg, we don't have any problem saying my leg is broken. Well, my brain is broken. I watched my daughter dying and being resuscitated, and something broke. So I think that it's just important that we surround ourselves with people who can potentially understand. They talk about vets watching maybe their friends, be injured or fearing for their own life or getting an injury themselves and needing to come home and find camaraderie. Well, these parents are going through the worst thing you can ever experience as a human being, watching your child suffer.
Yeah.
And if you don't find other people who have even an ounce, nobody's walking in anyone else's shoes. Nobody has the same journey. But if you can just find somebody who even has an ounce of understanding for what you might be experiencing, it's really important, and it saves lives.
Yeah. And that self-care is very important, because it's I don't have a special needs child, but I've watched people that do, and it's just, you're right. They are selfless and they don't take care of themselves. And it's like, well, if you don't take care of yourself, who's going to take care of your children?
Well, it's funny. I just started an organization completely. I've been working with pediatrics under Cannabis for 7 years. And this last year, I finally got together with one of my girlfriends. Actually, she's a former prosecutor. She's a very close friend of mine. I love her dearly. We started an organization called High Heal. And because I told her, I said, look, these moms are in, I was trying to do retreats every year and, find ways to make it not so isolating and depressing,
Yes.
And I said, but it's not just these special needs moms, it's women. I said, my mom's having heart attacks and strokes and still trying to go back to work. And, she's taking care of her elderly mom. I said, my dad's not doing any of that. What's going on here? So I started really looking into it a few years ago, with Canna Moms and the moms that we were dealing with in the special needs world. But I started looking outside of that. And there's just a lot of societal stigma to women being selfless. And like I said early on in this conversation we were having, women, born and with the idea that they're going to go have kids and then they raise them and they take care of them. They're the primary caregivers. They take them to the doctors. They do all the grocery shopping. They make all the decisions on healthcare and food. And then they take care of their spouse the same way. And then they're taking care of their elderly parents while they pass away. Who's asking that woman if she's okay? Because a lot of people ask me if my daughter's okay. And don't get me wrong, I'm not the center of my own universe anymore. I haven't been since I had children, and I understand that. But nobody ever came and asked me how I was. To this day, not a single one of my family members has ever asked me, how are you? And I think that's really important to note.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because it does take a toll on the family and it does take a toll on the primary caregiver.
Yeah.
So I think it's important work what you're doing. Well, if folks want to follow you and see what all you're up to, because it sounds like you've got a lot of things going on. What I guess drop us some links so that I can put those on the show notes.
I have what I've done. It was kind of an embarrassing thing to do, but one of my girlfriends convinced me to do it. So I just did a website in my own name. It's Moriah Barnhart, just as it's spelled.com. And from there, if people want to connect with me on Instagram, I get a lot of messages through Instagram. I left all that on the cover page. I did do a full bio so that it's easier when I'm going to speaking events, which I'm on my way to right now. I told you last night. They can just pull up my bio from there. And then there will be links to all of the company websites. Canna Moms isn't linked right now. The domain, something's going on with it. So I'm going to fix that right when we get off the phone, actually, on my way to this conference. But so that way they just have everything in one place. All my social media connections, all of my websites will be up there. And that just makes it so much easier.
Okay. Well, I will be sure and list those links on the show notes for today's episode. And again, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. And thanks for bringing to light the information with CPS and then also just self-care for women who are in this position.
Yeah, we need to change the paradigm in society. It's so funny because this isn't just me saying this anymore. There's a lot of evidence coming out about why men have been successful and why it is a man's world that we're living in. And it's because they never had to do their own laundry and wash their own dishes and take care of their own children. And honestly, I just posted something on social media this morning, has nothing to do with cannabis, nothing to do with me, nothing to do with advocacy. And it just basically outlines how Sigmund Freud, how he got to be who he was, how some of these famous composers had beautiful composer wives who never fulfilled their destiny the way their husbands did because they were caring for children. They're interrupted. They're taking care of the home and the meals. And so I just think that this isn't about feminism. This isn't about, buzzwords and hype. This is about saying we as a society, women do not take care of ourselves. And whatever it is we need, I love to cook. So whether that, talking about feminism and sexism and making dinner, I'm always going to make dinner because I enjoy that.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. We just have to learn what's been embedded in us by society versus what we really are enjoying. What do I want to spend my time on? Because it's really important that if I want to affect change in this world and I want to make dents in things that I feel like need fixing or changing or improvement, then I have to decide how I'm spending my time. We're all accountable for that. And as women, we need to kind of break the stigma of selflessness, that means self-sacrifice to a complete extent. We have to fill our cups before we can pour from them.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, those are great words of advice. And again, I really appreciate your time today and coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you so much for the platform you're providing. These stories are really important, and I appreciate you giving people the opportunity to share theirs.
Oh, absolutely. And if you know of anybody else that would like to come on and share, my ears are open.
Well, I know you're going to have Gail on, and she's amazing. So
I actually haven't heard back from her. So
we'll get you in touch, and then any other people you need to be in touch with, we'll make sure it happens.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Moriah, and good luck at your speaking event today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.
Show notes for today's episode can be found out at cannabishealsme.com/96. We will not have an educational episode this Thursday, so we'll be back here on Monday with yet another healing story. Until then, you guys have a great week, and thank you so much for listening. Tell 3 people about the podcast. Hit the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode of the Cannabis Heals Me podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast app you're using. Do you have a suggestion for a guest on Cannabis Heals Me? Send an email to podcast@cannabishealsme.com. We'd love to hear from you. Please do not take any information from Cannabis Heals Me or its guests as medical advice. Contact your licensed physician before taking cannabis or using it for medical treatments.